Enough about the allowable risk of assessing control risk too low. The second factor that the CPA must know to determine sample size is the tolerable deviation rate. Just like the allowable risk of assessing control risk too low, the tolerable deviation rate is a matter of the auditor's judgment. The definition of tolerable rate is the maximum rate of deviation from a control procedure that an auditor is willing to accept without changing their planned assessed level of control risk. You, the auditor, must determine the percentage of error rate that you can tolerate. Let's say you can tolerate a 4% error rate. If based on previous experience with this client, you expect an error rate of 7%, would you sample? The answer is no. If you expect the population to contain more errors than you can tolerate, do not sample. Go ahead and examine 100% of the items to find the material misstatements. Don't be too tough on yourself here. Realize that when you can tolerate more errors, you will establish a higher tolerable rate and therefore be allowed to decrease your sample size. The more deviations that you can tolerate, the less you have to sample. Again, just like the allowable risk of assessing control risk too low, we have an inverse relationship to sample size. The third and final factor that the auditor must consider to determine the sample size for attribute sampling is that of the expected population deviation rate. The expected population deviation rate is an estimate of the deviation rate in the entire population, not the sample, but the entire population. How does a CPA make an estimate of the deviations in the population? Well, the estimate may be based on a small preliminary sample, or the estimate might be based on last year's sample results. Don't worry about the how so much as know that the relationship between the expected population deviation rate and the sample size is direct. Oh, this is different from the allowable risk of assessing control risk too low and the tolerable deviation rate, which both had an inverse relationship to sample size. Here, when you expect the population to contain more errors, you should increase the sample size. The more errors you expect, the more you should sample. Hence, a direct relationship. Remember, don't sample if you expect more errors than you can tolerate. Notice that I've not given you a formula or method to compute the sample size for attribute sampling. That's because this is not tested on the CPA exam. In real life, auditors consult a table for the sample size. Hence, the examiners have decided to ask you questions about the factors the auditor considers and their effect on sample size. They are not going to test your ability to look items up on a table. Relax. Know the three factors and their relationship to sample size, and you are set. Almost. There is one more very important fact to understand about sample size for attribute sampling. The population size has little or no effect on the sample size for attribute sampling. That's right. Whether the client has 5,000 checks in the population or 5 million checks, the sample size for attribute sampling will be very close in size. One more time. For attribute sampling, the size of the population has little or no effect on sample size. A few other miscellaneous items about sample size. A CPA may perform a dual-purpose test. A dual-purpose test tests both the internal controls and the account balance. What sample size should the auditor use? The auditor should compute the sample size for the tests of controls and then compute the sample size for the substantive test of detail and select the larger of the two sample sizes. Dual-purpose testing selects the larger of the two sample sizes. Another point to be aware of is that auditors usually use a fixed sample size. This means the auditor determines the number of items to be tested and leaves it at that. However, know that a method called discovery or sequential sampling does not utilize a fixed sample size. Discovery or sequential sampling uses varying sample sizes depending upon results. How are voided items treated in a sample? If the client can show the CPA the voided item, the CPA examines the documents and says, "Fine, I will select another item to replace the voided item." If, however, the voided document cannot be located, the item is considered a deviation. When an auditor is unable to examine an item selected for testing, the item is considered to be a deviation. Upon completing the examination of the items in the sample, the auditor must evaluate the results. There are 3 steps to evaluate the results of an attribute sample. Oh, come on, don't give up. This is almost the final step in attribute sampling. The evaluation of an attribute sample is not even hard. Don't give up now. Fight for those points. Go for the 75. Don't accept a 74. Okay, here goes. The 3 steps to evaluating the results of an attribute sample are as follows. 1. Calculate the sample deviation rate. This is very easy. Simply count up the number of deviations found in the sample and divide the number of deviations by the total sample size. Let's say 1 deviation in a sample size of 10 would be 1 divided by 10, or a 10% sample deviation rate. Second, calculate the upper deviation limit. This isn't difficult either. The upper deviation limit is the allowance for sampling risk plus the sample deviation rate that you calculated above. How will you know what the allowance for sampling risk is? The allowance for sampling risk will be given in the question, since it is based upon the auditor's judgment. So the upper deviation limit is the allowance for sampling risk given in the question plus the sample deviation rate. Finally, compare the upper deviation limit with the tolerable deviation rate. If the upper deviation limit is greater than you can tolerate, you are a sad auditor. You just performed a sample of tests of controls that demonstrates that the controls are not operating effectively. Rats! Now you must assess control risk at a high level and increase the amount of substantive testing to keep the acceptable level of detection risk low. Ouch! Auditors are only happy when the upper deviation limit is less than they can tolerate. Then they say that the controls are operating effectively. Effective controls allow auditors to accept a higher level of detection risk and to decrease the amount of substantive testing. So 3 easy steps to evaluate the results of an attribute sample. First, compute the sample deviation rate by taking the number of deviations and dividing it by the sample size. Second, take the sample deviation rate that you just calculated and add it to the allowance for sampling risk to get the upper deviation limit. Finally, compare the upper deviation limit with the tolerable rate. If the upper deviation limit exceeds what you can tolerate, the auditor is not happy. The results of the test do not support the planned assessed level of control risk. Upon completion of the numerical calculations, the auditor will also take time to consider the qualitative aspects of the sample results. CPAs are concerned about the nature and cause of each deviation. For example, if the deviations result from the client committing simple mistakes, it is not a problem. However, if the deviations result from the client committing fraud or illegal acts, the auditor would be very worried. Watch out, auditors. When illegal acts or fraud occur, heighten your professional skepticism. This concludes our discussion of attribute sampling for tests of controls. Now, let's move on to variable sampling.